and I'm happy to sign it. Thank you so much, Emily, and to Sue and everyone here at Mead Gardens. Cindy, it's always one of my favorite places to come when I need to get a piece of peace or want to entertain visitors or just have a beautiful day. So I'm really happy to be here. Some of you may know I've been living in Winter Park for over 36 years now, and I'm a fourth generation Floridian, and always in my heart is what's happening in the state of Florida and my admiration for the many people who have worked to save what is here. So what I'll be talking about today is the role of women in the environmental movement in Florida in the 20th century. This stems from my work as a PhD student. I was a very late life PhD, and luckily got a job at Rollins where I can teach and talk about this all the time anyway. But from my dissertation, I wrote this book for a general public audience, and I hope what it will do is inspire people and think about how women created change even when they really had no political power at all. So we'll be talking about that today. And because I'm a historian, we have to step back before the 20th century to get started here. So to understand people's attitudes in the 20th century, we have to look back and see what was happening in the years before. And when America was colonized by European settlers, the first thing they thought of when they looked at this continent was just massive amounts of natural resources. I mean, all the great forests in Europe were gone. The streams were empty of fish. The big, large wild animals were depopulated. So when they stepped onto the North American continent, it was an amazing place. And this myth sort of arose of this idea of superabundance, that we would always have all these resources and it was just going to be a marvelous place to live. But by the end of the 1800s, it had become apparent that that simply was not true. And I have 3 examples for you that really kind of shocked the human consciousness in the United States into understanding that was indeed a myth. First of all, the bison. I mean, that's the greatest symbol, isn't it, of the American West and the frontier. And we once had, millions of them crossing the continent. They were in Florida. There were Spanish explorers, saw them up in Payne's Prairie. And so we know how abundant they once were. But by the late 1800s, all but maybe 200 were still alive. And most of those there was a herd at Yellowstone, and the rest were in zoos on the East Coast. And suddenly this idea that things could disappear became apparent to everyone. Probably there was no greater example than the passenger pigeon. Once in the billions of birds, they would fly across the sky in flocks that pioneers described as blackening the sky. There were so many of them, and they would nest together, and they were very sociable animals. But by 1914, the very last passenger pigeon died in the Cincinnati Zoo. Martha. Poor Martha. And now if you want to see a passenger pigeon, you have to pretty much go to a natural history museum and maybe find a stuffed pigeon to look at. This was incomprehensible to Americans that they could go extinct, but this word started to creep in, extinction. Things can disappear. The last Carolina parakeet died in the same zoo a few years after Martha. These parakeets were once in Florida. They've been described all up and down the St. Johns River. They covered the southeastern United States. We had our own parakeet, but they disappeared. And again, this term extinction made us come to terms with the fact that things were limited in abundance. Does this sound okay for everybody? Okay, wave it if it isn't. So talking about birds, we're in nesting season right now. Mead Gardens is such a wonderful example. And it's springtime. It's a wonderful time to be a bird. Snowy egrets put on extra feathers. See those extra feathers, the extra plumage, in order to, nest and get lucky. And that's a great thing if you're a snowy egret, but not so much if you're valued more as a decoration for a lady's hat. And this is what was happening in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. As you can see, these women have entire bird bodies on their hats. This was the fashion. And it extended from the United States into Europe. What kind of birds would you want for your hat? Well, really pretty ones, really colorful ones, big feathers, right? Exactly like the snowy egrets, exactly like the Carolina parakeets offered, and a lot of our wading birds in Florida, which made Florida ground zero for a lot of the bird killing that was going on. It's estimated that hundreds of thousands of wading birds were killed across the southeastern United States to supply the millinery trade, which was mostly located in New York and London. It was a $7 million a year business. And it provided money and income for people living in pretty hard scrabble areas like the Everglades. And it was really easy to go in and kill these birds, because if you've ever been over to Craft Garden or to any of the nesting places, you'll see that a lot of these birds will nest all together in one tree or in very concentrated areas. You go in with a shotgun, you shoot them, you strip those plumage feathers off the adults, and then what you leave behind are babies and eggs. So you've killed 2 generations now of birds. And Florida's birds were in serious trouble by 1900. So who are we going to blame for this? Who's wearing the hats? We're going to blame women, right? So women believed that it was their moral cause to take up the issue of this. And in March 1900, Clara Domrick did just that here in Central Florida. Many of you may be familiar with the term Domrick Estates. That was the property that Clara's family lived on. Clara is a really interesting person. She and her husband Louis were from Germany, both German immigrants. She was his second wife. They came down to Maitland and built this beautiful house on Lake Minnehaha. That was their winter home. They were snowbirds, right? The original snowbirds. They came down by train, and they came down in the winter to grow oranges, which they thought was a great product. They got out of the cold. They got out of the dirty air in urban New York City where they lived. Louis was a very wealthy textile and silk merchant. But they loved Florida. They loved the birds. They made their property a bird sanctuary, and every morning Louis would go out on the balcony, put out bird seed, and whistle for the birds to come. So they were very attuned to that. And Clara was very attuned to the fact that birds were disappearing. And we're coming up to the anniversary, March 2nd, 1900. Clara calls together the who's who of Orlando, Winter Park, and Maitland, which wasn't a huge group, but a very influential group, and together they decide to create the Florida Audubon Society. The Audubon Societies had started cropping up in different cities and states around the nation, many of them created by women, again, who wanted to address the problems with birds. And so Clara followed their lead. They adopted, on their first meeting, they adopted rules for the Audubon Society. They decided on dues. They decided to create a media campaign to try to get public awareness about birds. And they decided to also go to the state legislature to get bird protection laws enacted. Here's some of the early women who were very active in the early Audubon movement in Florida. Mary Bar Monroe, this is the only known picture we have of Mary. She lived in Coconut Grove and helped found the Audubon Society down in the Miami area. Her husband was a well-known children's author, Kirk Monroe. And Mary was a real powerhouse, according to the early Audubon histories. She would go into hotels in Miami and restaurants, and if she saw you wearing a plumed hat, she would give you what for, and it was described that she left many women crying or taking off their hats and promising never to wear them ever again. And that was part of her personal mission as well. On the left is a group of students and teachers along with an Audubon leader who founded the St. Petersburg Audubon Society. And together, they put together this 70-foot petition to save the robin, to take to the legislature. Now, note the year, 1913. Can women vote? No. But look at this picture. What does this say to you? They're all wearing white. Do they look dangerous? Do they look scary? Well, if you know suffrage and all, you would know that that is kind of a signal. But what they did is they got people to sign a petition. They went to the all-male state legislature, and that year they got protection for the robin. It had been in trouble because farmers believed robins were agricultural pests. And so this was a way for women to respond, and I see this as early grassroots, right? You don't have political power, you're not represented in the legislature, but you can create change by showing numbers, right? And this is a tactic that women use throughout this period. One thing you may not know is that women were responsible for the first state park in Florida. There was a beautiful hammock, which is kind of like a rise in the Everglades that had a lot of tropical plants, orchids, and birds, but also was populated by royal palms, which you'll see on the left. Women were, I should say botanists, early male botanists had been trying to get this area preserved for years, but could never get the traction to get any kind of protections for it until they went to the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs and asked the women for help. And indeed, that's exactly what happened. The women's clubs picked it as their #1 agenda item. They worked on it. They got one of their members, who was the widow of Henry Flagler, to donate some land. Then they went to the legislature and got the legislature to double the size of that land, because the legislature held deed to the Everglades lands. They put it all together and they created Royal Palm State Park. And later they built a lodge for visitors and scientists to come and study the area and the botanical wealth there. So how did the women do it? Well, they did petitions. They talked to all the men in their lives. They went to Tallahassee and lobbied. They walked the corridors there and made their voices heard. And when this park was created, it was the very first state park in the United States created by women's clubbers. And it was heralded across the United States. Big stories, and there were clubs in every single state, but this was definitely considered a big example for other people to follow. And it holds even more importance than this. First, hang on. Because Royal Palm becomes the nucleus of Everglades National Park when that's established in 1947. How many of you have been to Everglades National Park? All right, how many of you have walked the Anhinga Trail at the park? It's one of the first trails you come to. It's a big boardwalk, lots of alligators, lots of birds. So you think you did? That was Royal Palm State Park. The Royal Palms are pretty much gone now because of hurricanes over the years. There's a few there, but that was the original state park that, of course, was expanded into, is now millions of acres in South Florida. But this is a picture of, at the dedication of the national park, of women's club members who were being appreciated for their contribution. Now, the state of Florida does not recognize Royal Palm as the first state park because the women kept the deed to it until they signed it over to the national park. They never let the state run it. And there were a few reasons for this. First of all, they asked the state to give them money to help run the park, and the state said no. So what did the women do? They raised the money themselves. They had campaigns, penny and dime campaigns. They went to every rich person they knew and asked them for money. Eventually, they walked the halls of Tallahassee to get some money. At one point, the head of the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs suggested that all members should perhaps tell their husbands that there will be, if there's no park, there will be no pie. Her name was May Nan Jennings. Jennings led the Florida Federation of Women's Clubs through the acquirement and creation of Royal Palm State Park, but she did so much more than that. She was the widow of a Florida governor, and so she knew how Tallahassee operated. She'd been in Tallahassee. She lived in Jacksonville after her husband's death, but she was heavily involved in Florida forestry issues and beautification. I mean, you name it, suffrage. May was there. Her archives are a treasure up at the University of Florida that you can read. I want to tell one more story about May, just to give you an idea about how women's clubs worked. When May wanted to go up to Tallahassee to get approval for Royal Palm State Park, what she did is she activated her network. So she contacted a friend in Tallahassee who was a member of the women's clubs, who contacted the governor's wife in Tallahassee, so that when May went to Tallahassee, she stayed at the governor's mansion. How's that for influence? And her biographer calls it her old girls network. And and I think that's a pretty apt description. Now, the Jennings family owned a lot of forestry land, but the women's clubs were very, very concerned about the state of Florida's forests. And here's why. On the left, you'll see a healthy longleaf pine forest. Longleaf pine once covered the southeastern United States from Virginia to Lake Okeechobee to Louisiana. It was unbelievable landscape, and these were really tall, straight pine trees. Out here in Mead Gardens, they have a demonstration garden, and they have some longleaf pine if you want to see some. But they were really, really lovely for a lot of things. First of all, they had sap that was kind of termite-proof, so it's the perfect thing to build your house out of. And if you've ever seen an old house with heart pine in it, that's what was longleaf pine. They're also very straight and tall, which is great for utility poles. They make for great fencing. And so longleaf pines were cut down. And if you remember back to this whole myth of superabundance, everyone thought, well, we can cut down the trees, and then what will we do? We'll just move on because there's more forests. We'll just keep going. There's no thought to replanting, and that's exactly what this second photo demonstrates. How they would cut and burn often. Also, longleaf pines were wanted for the turpentine industry, in which their sap was removed and then processed to become naval stores and liquids like turpentine. But it was very damaging to the trees. The majority of them died as a result of it. So longleaf pines were really under attack and in bad shape. Why did women care? Well, birds lived in trees, right? It's ugly. It looks, it could be a fire hazard. And so women in the women's clubs, but also in the garden clubs, which were almost all female, agreed that this was something that needed to be addressed. And May helped write some of the early legislation to protect Florida's forests. And this whole idea of conservation, of replanting forests, are starting about the same time. The other reason women cared about this is that it was becoming widely recognized that trees are important to water resources. They help prevent erosion, besides creating habitat, and so women across the country were also talking about saving trees. Here's a specific example. The senator, how many of you have ever seen the senator or remember the senator? Yeah, it was amazing, right? This friend of mine took this photo about 6 months before, as you may recall, it burned down. But in 1930, the Florida Federation of Garden Clubs created fencing to put around the tree to protect it. So they recognized that this was a really important tree and wanted to offer some protections for it. And Winter Park has its own story as well. There was a point of time in the 1950s where there was a road between Orlando and Winter Park, and I'm still not sure exactly which road it was, but this county wanted to widen it. But it had a huge number of oak trees all along the side of the road. And so the women's garden clubs in Orlando and Winter Park recognized that all these trees were going to be torn down for this road widening. So they went to work. And here's a quote from the Florida magazine from 1953. They called them vigilantes. Because look what they did. They stood in front of the bulldozers. They climbed up in the trees, someone told me later. Her mother had climbed a tree. They set up a table to get people to sign petitions. They served refreshments. But the newspaper saw it as them kept high-paid labor and costly equipment idle. These are vigilantes, can you imagine? And ultimately, the sheriff showed up with a cease and desist and made the women leave, and the trees were cut down. But one of the leaders of the Winter Park leaders was asked to be on Winter Park's first tree board. And so there was recognition again, that women have a real role to play. They may not be getting elected to the city commission, but they have a role to play. And Winter Park also, with the force of women in the I believe it was 1920s, adopted city planning, garbage pickup and all, and a lot of that was pushed by women who wanted to make change in their cities. City beautification was a huge issue. Nobody wanted to leave New England and move to Florida and have these kinds of cities. Look at the roads. They're dirt. There's cows and pigs wandering the streets because there's garbage being thrown out. No one is maintaining any kind of greenery, and so women's clubs got involved in city beautification. In some cases, that was the reason why women created local clubs, was because they wanted to address beautification issues. In some cities, women hired caretakers to clean up, or to clean up cemeteries, certainly, to plant trees, to maintain the area, because this was something they were considering, considered a quality of life. And at this point, women are thinking beyond their house. They're thinking about, if I'm the keeper of the home, well, my community is my home too. And so this justifies me getting involved in civic affairs, because I am trying to create a better home for myself and for my family. In Orlando, had a contest to name the city, give us our slogan, and there was a woman, and I can't find her name, who won the contest to give Orlando the name The City Beautiful, and which is still used today. And one of my favorite examples from Orlando is Maud Neff Whitman, who became the first female member and then ran the show for the Orlando Park Board, and she was known for going out to Lake Eola and planting plants herself to make it pretty. And she was heavily involved in all kinds of things, from Rollins to the local garden clubs, all different kinds of organizations. But she was a real activist making a change. And if you thought your city was ugly, just wait till everybody's driving a car. And then when everybody's driving a car, everybody wants to put a sign up along the side of the road. This was something that really upset women, especially the garden clubs, because why go out and plant trees and flowering bushes if someone's just going to put a tacky sign up on the side of it, right? There were people who did surveys and saw hundreds of billboards, along different roads. This is a scene from Mount Dora. And the women argued, first of all, this is ugly, but secondly, this is dangerous. If people are reading these billboards while they're driving, this is a dangerous situation. And so, and the garden clubs particularly took the lead in fighting for better signage, more controlled signage, and throughout the 20th century were kind of a pain in the neck to the advertising industry. But that's what they pressed for. And I mean, we don't want to live with this, right? I don't know. I don't want to look at that many signs. So one of my favorite subjects that I found going through all of this history is the three Marjories. And they are really important to women's attitudes and actions throughout the 20th century, and they reflect a changing role for women as well. Marjorie Kinnan Rawlings, my heart author, who moved with her husband from Rochester, New York, to the small little hamlet of Cross Creek, Florida, between Gainesville and Ocala. She and her husband just had a dream. They were going to buy a farm with orange groves, and those oranges were going to pay for them so that they could just write. And she was going to write Gothic romance novels, and he was a magazine writer who wrote extensively for the Saturday Evening Post, and he was going to write about yachting and boating activities. So first of all, there aren't a lot of yachting and boating activities in the Cross Creek area. So that didn't go well with Charles from the beginning. But Rawlings found an editor, and she would write him these extensive letters talking about all the people she'd met in Cross Creek. And he finally said to her, "Why don't you write about them?" And she had an incredible ear for dialect and for hearing conversations and recording them. And so Rawlings starts writing a series of books. Her best known is probably The Yearling, which won the Pulitzer Prize in 1939, was made into a movie with Gregory Peck, and got great acclaim. And in that, she is telling the story of people living the rural lifestyle, hard scrabble lifestyle in the Ocala Scrub area. After that, she writes Cross Creek, which is kind of a memoir of her time living there. She writes a cookbook because all the soldiers couldn't stand all the food that was in Cross Creek, and they wanted to get the real recipes. And she, at one point in her career, is selling more books than Hemingway, Woolf, and Fitzgerald combined. Very well known. We now have she's been relegated to a regional youth writer, which I think is totally unfair. But what she did for Florida is she opened the eyes to the rest of the country and the world. I mean, her books are translated across the world to the beauty of rural Florida. And during World War II, she ended up divorced but remarried, had a wonderful second marriage. Her second husband is overseas during World War II, and she writes him a letter and says, I've been asked to write an article for Collier's magazine to talk about the importance of forests in the United States. And I think I'm going to do it. And she says, and the thing is, she goes, my books may never be read again, but I might be known as the gal who saved America's forests. Her reputation was a little bit better than that, but she had some consciousness that things were disappearing and needed to be conserved. The second Marjorie is Marjorie Harris Carr. And I was fortunate enough to meet Carr near the end of her life. She was such a character. She was a trained scientist. She had her master's in biology. And her husband, Archie Carr, is known as the man who saved sea turtles. He was the big scientist at the University of Florida who first tracked what was happening with sea turtles, where they nested, and really alerted us all to the importance of that. She helped him in his research, and they spent a lot of time down in Costa Rica, and when they moved back to Florida, so Archie could teach at UF, she became a local activist. She helped save trees in Micanopy, she helped preserve Payne's Prairie, and then joined the board, I don't know if it was the board, but she joined Alachua Audubon Society. And one day got a phone call from a friend of hers in Jacksonville who said, hey, have you heard about this canal they're gonna build across Florida? To connect the St. Johns River, and therefore the Atlantic Ocean, with the Gulf of Mexico. Carr hadn't heard anything about it. And she takes it to the Audubon Society and says, what's going on here? We should look into this. And that's when they realized that Congress had authorized this huge project for the Army Corps of Engineers to dig a canal to connect the St. Johns River to the Gulf of Mexico using the path of the Ocklawaha River. Well, that was a problem for Carr because she adored the Ocklawaha River. It's a beautiful serpentine waterway. I've been on it many times. And she wanted to do her best to save it. She recognized the value, the ecological value of it. So she and Audubon Society started a campaign to just try to get the Army Corps of Engineers to move the route, right? Save the river, move the route. The Army Corps of Engineers dismisses her, treats her like she doesn't know anything at all. I mean, they would get up in meetings and say, now, Mrs. Carr, you don't know what you're talking about. But she would then get up with all kinds of facts. That was always her thing. Use facts and scientific information to fight the Army Corps. Ultimately, and it's a long story, and there's books that have been written about it, ultimately she helped create a group called the Florida Defenders of the Environment, which are still active today. They stopped the canal by presidential edict. President Nixon stopped it. Over $70 million in sunk costs. So part of it got built, part of it did not. And if you're ever driving up to Gainesville on I-75, you've probably seen an overpass that says the Marjorie Carr Greenway. That was part of the path that had been condemned that would have been the canal, and now is a greenway that you can hike and horseback ride and bike on as well. It was national news. Reader's Digest called it Rape of the Ocklawaha. That was their headline. They had national headlines. No one could believe that this had happened. And what it really was an enormous grassroots effort that Carr led. She had people from across the state of Florida. She had experts from throughout academia. And they put together the very first environmental impact statement for this project that was never required. Up until the 1970s, you did not have to write an environmental impact statement if you were doing a project like this. But ultimately, we do have federal laws that are passed, and the president recognized it and stopped it. Today, there's still remnants of the canal. Yeah, she is my shiro. But there are remnants of the canal that still exist. There's a big dam, the Rodman Dam up north of Gainesville, that's still there, and FDE is still fighting to get that dam removed. It has outlived its lifespan, and now they think worry is becoming a danger, but if they could restore it, they could bring back the free-flowing Ocklawaha again. I can go on and on about Marjorie. Oops, I missed one. And of course, most of you probably know, there you go, Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, the patron saint of the Everglades, who, most of you may have read her books. She brought attention to the Everglades. She was there on the committee that got the Everglades Park created. Her book was written in 1947. But what you may not know about her is that she did not become an activist till very late in life. We always associate her with that. But it wasn't until she was 78 years old that she actually became an activist. She stopped one night at a grocery store to buy cat food. I mean, we've all been there, right? And she sees this young woman that she knew was fighting this huge project. The project was a federal project to put a jet port in the on the edge of Everglades National Park, and it was to be a huge commercial jet port to serve the Miami area. And there was an activist group that had risen up, and Douglas recognized one of the activists there and said, good for you. Glad to see you doing this. And the young girl, she said, turned on her and said, yeah, well, what are you doing? And Douglas said, well, I wrote the book, And the young woman said, that's just not enough. We need you to join in. And Douglas said, in order to get out of the store, she said, oh, okay, I'll do whatever I can. And the next day they were on her doorstep and said to her, we need your help. And one of the things you might be able to do is help us create a grassroots organization to fight this jet port. And so Douglas thought about it, and a couple months later creates the Friends of the Everglades, which is still in existence today. And she becomes a huge activist and leader. It costs you $1 a person to join the Friends of the Everglades. So she made it something that everyone could join. She would take those numbers, the force of that, with her to planning meetings and, everywhere. And she would get up to speak. And she was maybe 5 feet tall. And late in life, as you can see, she had terrible eyesight. She wore big, thick glasses. She always wore a big floppy straw hat. And she couldn't hear very well, but she had taken elocution lessons in college, and she said she could throw her voice across the room. And one of her things she would say is, those developers and all, they can't be mean to me because I'm a little old lady in tennis shoes. But I can be rude to them. And she would let them have it. And you did not want to be a developer with a proposal that Marjorie Douglas showed up to oppose. As a matter of fact, you didn't want to be a governor who proposed legislation that she didn't like, because she would call you on the phone and tell you what she thought exactly about it. And the thing is, and what I say to my students, it's never too late to be an activist. And here's the power of one, a woman who used facts, who could gather people together into grassroots, right? And if you live to be 108, 78 is not a bad place to start. You can get a lot done. And now and her story is really the story of the Everglades. 100 years, when the year she was born, we were fighting to drain the Everglades. And by the time she died, we were fighting to save the Everglades. So attitudes can change, but I think she's just a marvelous example of how you make that happen. So that by the middle of the 20th century, things have changed. Women are no longer just working in all-female groups. They are now activist groups, like you saw with Friends of the Everglades and the Florida Defenders of the Environment, that are male and female. Women's actions are valued. Women are voting, right? But new issues are happening across the country, but also in Florida. People did not move to Florida for dirty air or dirty water. And that was what was starting to become very apparent by the 1940s and the 1950s by sheer population growth in the state. We had factories spewing all kinds of smoke that was not regulated. There was no Clean Air Act at the time. There was some women who reported in the 1950s in Jacksonville that their stockings had melted off their legs from the air pollution coming from a local plant. There was a woman in Polk County who complained bitterly that her husband had gotten asthma problems from the smoke coming from a phosphate plant. And she said, this is not why we moved here. Fish kills were happening. Waterways were polluted because where did we put our sewage? In the water. Did we treat it? No. So we just thought that if we dump it into lakes and into rivers and or off the coast, it would certainly dilute and go away. And that's fine if you're one person, right? But when you're millions, now it starts to become concentrated and really problematic. So one of the groups that really stepped in to fight these issues in mid-century was the League of Women Voters, who is still a pretty kick-ass environmental group right now, if you ask me. They fought for all kinds of, in Florida we had all kinds of pollution. We had a pollution board that was created, pollution board hearings. People voiced their objections. You know, we want clean water. I mean, there were stories off Miami Beach. They had a big pipe that just dumped raw sewage. And the fishermen would always go there because they knew the fish would gather around it. And they called it the Rose Bowl because of the color coming out. I mean, yeah. But we did not have sewage treatment in Florida until the 1970s. So think about that. That's something we take for granted now, but it was incredibly important. Endangered species also bring women into the Florida environmental movement. Shirley Reynolds and Rita Alexander had begged Volusia County to do something about lighting on the beach because baby sea turtles, after they hatch, are supposed to be drawn to the moonlight over the water, right? But instead they were ending up on highways and in parking lots and getting killed. And by this point, the Endangered Species Act had been enacted nationally. And so turtles were protected. We understood their numbers were in trouble. Volusia County blew them off. The Chamber of Commerce accused them of trying to hurt business. They were threatened. They had all kinds of, bad jujube. And so what did they do? They filed suit in federal court using the Endangered Species Act. So another tool in the environmental movement. And the federal judge found in their favor. And as a result, any of you who ever go to the beach in the summer, you turn your lights off at night, right? You close the shades on your windows. We all learned to live with it. But it was largely because of their activism and their tenacity that happened. The Save the Manatee Club was founded by a woman who was standing in her back porch in Fort Lauderdale and saw boats screaming up and down the New River, and she knew there were manatees there. And when she went to the local board to ask, maybe can we put some speed limits on the boaters, one man suggested that she get a box of tomatoes and just throw them at the boats as they come by. Not a good answer. So she ended up working with Florida Audubon and then helping create the Save the Manatee Club, which I would argue is one of the best marketing programs you've ever seen. I mean, people around the world love manatees, and there's not a whole lot of interaction that we have with them, but people love manatees, and it's really an incredible story. And again, they were on the endangered species list as well. Environmental justice also brings women into the environmental movement. You may not care about birds or manatees or forests, but you might care about the condition of the people who are they're going to be the most affected by a degraded environment. And this brings a lot of women in. It's a social justice issue. This is something my students are very, very aware of and very interested in right now. Joy Ezel has been working for over 3 decades to try to save and clean up the Finn Holloway River, which is up in Perry, Florida. The Finn Holloway was once a river that had hotels. They bottled spring water from the river. It was a resort area. But in the 1940s, during World War II, the officials in Taylor County and the city of Perry, which is a very rural, fairly low-income area, went to the state legislature and the all-male legislature and said, hey, we've got an opportunity to bring in a pulp mill to Perry. And the pulp mill needs water, And so what we would like you to do is designate the Finn Holloway an industrial river. And that's exactly what the legislature did. And in doing that, that meant that the company could dump anything it wanted into the river. And some of the things that it dumped were chemicals including dioxin, which is considered the most cancer-causing chemical in the world. Dioxin is a byproduct of us all wanting white toilet tissue or white sanitary napkins. It's from the bleaching process. And so when Joy had gone away to college and came home, and her grandmother, she went to turn on the tap in her grandmother's house, and she said, "Ooh, it smells like Buckeye." That was the name of the pulp mill. You've all driven by pulp mills, right? You know that smell. But that's what the water smelled like. And Joy said, "This is something wrong here." And she'd had science degrees, and she understood what was going on, and it became her mission. She discovered that a lot of the local wells had been contaminated. To this day, she will not drink any water or have any ice in any restaurant in Perry. She only carries bottled water with her. But she's been working for decades for this. So just last year, the mill, which has changed hands multiple times, announced that it had solved the problem. You ready? Here's how they solved it. Instead of discharging into the Finn Holloway River, they just ran a pipe all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. Yeah, so now it goes straight into the Gulf of Mexico, which people on upstream, downstream of the current are not happy about, and there already is a dead zone at the mouth of the river now, where just nothing exists. And so she, again, the state thinks it's all been resolved, but I don't think that her battle is over yet at all. Jeannie Economist, many of you may be familiar with Jeannie. She's a local activist up in Apopka with the Florida Farm Workers Association. She's been working for years to try to help the farm workers that once worked at Lake Apopka and were contaminated by chemicals used by in agricultural applications. I mean, some of them remember getting sprayed out in the field and not knowing what the chemicals were, and now what she has documented is generational disease, including cancer, miscarriages, immune system problems, and behind her in this picture is a quilt. Do you remember the AIDS quilt? These are each of these squares is the name of someone who has died, a farm worker who has died, and they believe it was related to the chemicals. Now, we've done huge studies on the alligators in Lake Apopka, but we have never done a huge full-scale health study of the farm workers, and she's been fighting again for decades for this. I know. All right, so by the end of the 20th century, things have really changed. Remember, women are voting, women are working with men in organizations, women are becoming leaders of those organizations, and importantly, they are now also becoming part of the state bureaucracy. Mary Grizzle was the Republican mother of five. She's a PTA mom who decided to run for the state legislature from St. Petersburg. And she was really, really interested in women's issues. She was worried about alimony and divorce. And, up until the 70s, women couldn't even have their own checking accounts and things like that. But she ended up also getting involved in environmental issues. And she was the leader of the movement to force in Tampa Bay, tertiary treatment of sewage before it got dumped into Tampa Bay. And I grew up on Tampa Bay, and I remember the smell at low tide, and it is much better now. And Mary is largely credited with bringing that to the area. Victoria Schinkel, at 30 years old, becomes the head of the Florida Department of Environmental Regulation, one of the youngest heads ever of that department. She came in from out of state and worked to create all kinds of state legislation and bureaucracies in order to address environmental problems in the state. She was always widely regarded as the smartest woman in the room, but she could get along with everybody, and to this day continues her work with the 1,000 Friends of Florida, which has been fighting for better growth management in the state of Florida. So her fight is not over. And finally, Carol Browner. Carol Browner was the longest serving chief of the EPA in the United States. She served in the Clinton administration, but she started out, she grew up in Miami, where she developed a love of Florida. She became an attorney. She worked in the state legislature. She counseled Senator Al Gore and a lot of different people in Washington, D.C., and ultimately was chosen to run the EPA. And while she was there, she would go to hearings, especially on issues of toxic chemical dumps. That was one of her big issues, was toxic waste, Superfund issues. And she would say to Congress and to groups, I'm a mother. I have a son. This matters to me. And she would get totally poo-pooed by Congress people. Come on, she's, talking like a mother. But you know what? Women get it. We care about what happens to our kids too, right? Joy Ezell describes herself on the Finn Holloway as a mama bear. She says, you just don't mess with a mama bear. And this is, using our roles as mothers and women, no one is ashamed to do that. And certainly Carol Browner did that. And I would say to you, if we go from Carol Browner's desk at the EPA all the way back to Clara Domrick's living room in her house in Maitland, women have had a huge arc of change in the state of Florida and have been really important in the movement as well. They didn't pass all the laws, they didn't pass all the protections, but they were able to create grassroots movements that convinced male politicians to join in their cause. They convinced the public to join in those issues, and that's the lesson they have for us today. They used the news media in any way they could. They formed together. They did petitions. Now you can do those online, which is so awesome, and used any means that they could to get the word across. And they were very effective. They may not have been given credit for it, but they were very effective. Many of these organizations, the men would be the head of the organizations, and the women would be the doers. Is anybody shocked by that at all? Yeah. So this is what's included in my book that was mentioned earlier, and this is what I've been working in. I really feel like we are their inheritors or their heirs. My other book that I just wanted to mention is The Wilder Heart of Florida. This just came out 2 years ago, and it's a series of essays written by different authors around the state of Florida talking about our favorite places in Florida. I have an essay about the Disney Wilderness Preserve, which is one of my favorite places. And the tactic with this book is that if we want you to care about it, we want you to love it too. So that's what we've been doing here. So anyway, thank you. I'm happy to take some questions, and I appreciate you all coming out today. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned the woman in Maitland who, did she start the Audubon Society or just the branch in Maitland?
No, she started the state Audubon Society.
But there was a national already.
Not really. They were starting by state, and then they created the national umbrella, and she was on that early edge. But they eventually joined that national umbrella, and then there were also city Audubon, local Audubon societies too. And that's how the women's club operated, and that's how the garden clubs operated. They were always local, and then state, and then national, and they would talk back and forth to each other. They would set agendas, hearing what the others were doing. So that's how the national women's clubs knew about the Florida clubs creating a park, even though the women in California may be busy with trees, but they would talk to each other and compare notes. Yes, ma'am?
Dr. Poole, would you please give us a little bit of an update on the Florida Forever program, and also a little something mentioned about the Amendment 1 passage?
Okay, so Amendment 1, if we're talking about the same one, several years ago, by over 75%, the state of Florida voted for an amendment that would fund land purchase programs in the state of Florida. The legislature for many years did not use that money, and there were lawsuits filed, and now they are starting to use that money, and part of it this year was used for the Florida Wildlife Corridor. This has become a really important project, connecting different big pieces of land, for example, a state forest to a state park to a national forest, so that large animals can move around the state, which is really important, so that they don't become too genetically similar, or you can find new food sources as well. If you're interested in that, there's actually a film coming out next week, The Path of the Panther, that's going to be showing at local theaters, and it really talks about the wildlife corridors, and it talks about efforts to try to help the panther, which is the primary animal that really needs some space. It was not meant to live in the Everglades, and it didn't originally. But thank you. I think we're back on land buying. The one thing, and I'll say this, the one thing in this incredibly polarized political world we seem to be living in right now, the one thing we always seem to agree on is funding the Everglades restoration. That requires Congress, and it requires the state legislature to cough up money every year to keep funding that. And that's the one, it's kind of become this sacred animal. It's just fabulous. So there are some things we can agree upon, and the environment, I believe, is one of them. Yes?
I get notices from the Army Corps of Engineers about the Everglades update, and it's gone on for decades now. Can you give us an update on what is that?
Yeah.
Everglades.
So the minute we drained the Everglades in the 60s, we began to realize, oops, that was a really bad idea. The national park wasn't getting enough water because the national park really is at the bottom, right, of the drain for the water system that actually starts at Disney. The Everglades system begins at Disney and moves all the way south. During the Clinton administration, they signed the CERP, Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Program, which is the largest restoration program in the world. It's now exceeded $8 billion. And it's being watched by countries across the globe because of its really ambitious effort to replumb the Everglades. They will never be what they once were, but they want to at least increase the water flow to more natural levels. I was just down there last year, and one of their biggest projects that they have mostly completed is the elevation of Tamiami Trail. If any of you have ever driven on Tamiami Trail, when it was built, it was like this modern miracle of engineering, but what it really built was like a levee, like a dam all the way across the Everglades so that you could drive cars on it. And now what they're doing is elevating it and make it more of a bridge so the water can flow. But the water is still controlled by humans, at the working the gears to release water or not. And there's a lot of work now going on with biologists who are saying, yeah, you can't just drop water when you feel like it. Birds need certain levels at certain times of the year, and they're trying to work with that. It's going to be a massive ongoing project. I don't see it ending anytime soon. But there's an example of cooperation. And the Army Corps of Engineers now is the green arm of the United States government, they will tell you, because now they're doing environmental restoration on things that they messed up in the first place. But they did a great job. They drained the state like they said they were going to, and then realized that was a really bad idea.
Well, it wasn't a bad idea for the people who live on it.
Well, although now their wells are going dry, or getting saltwater intrusion. So, anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
What about the sugar plantations? Do we have a lot of sugar farms and stuff? What's happening with that? I think at one point the state was going to buy them up and get rid of them because they use so much water. I think that was it.
Yeah, they do use a lot of water, and they pump water back and forth in Lake Okeechobee, and when they pump it back, it's contaminated with all kinds of chemicals. That is hugely controversial. The soil is subsiding, it's going down. Originally the great dream of draining the Everglades was because the soil was so peaty and black and everything would grow and it would be incredible levels. Even Marjorie Stoneman Douglas wasn't against farming in parts of the Everglades. But what they discovered is that it was missing a few minerals, and so they have to add chemicals. And then, of course, as you grow the same crop over and over and over again, it needs more and more chemicals and pesticides. And so there's a belief among some scientists that eventually the sugarcane fields will have to leave because they will have eaten up all the soil, it'll be gone. And then there's also hopes that parts of it can be purchased and turned into water reservoirs and try to stop some of this chemical. There are regulations to try to reduce the amount of phosphorus that goes into the system from there. One of the new big issues down in the Everglades, it's not new, but it's newly publicized, is burning these sugarcane fields, because they do it year-round. They burn them and then harvest them. It's an easier way of harvesting, and it creates all kinds of toxic chemicals in the air. And again, an environmental justice area. The people who live around these sugarcane farms are not rich people, and they tend to be minorities and low income, and their health is being affected adversely. There have been quite a few studies. The Everglades Coalition has been working on that, and Everglades Foundation too. I could go on and on, but I don't have enough time. Yes.
Leslie, a great presentation, thank you.
Yes.
What's happening, what are you and the league doing locally from an ecological restoration, preservation standpoint?
I have to say I've been really busy and I haven't been involved in the league that much lately, but I still think the league is super important because what they're willing to do is sue. They will use their resources. First of all, the League of Women Voters is not all women anymore. Men have been in, there have been men presidents locally. The league in Orange County is the largest in the country. And so they're very involved, and they have committees on just about anything you want to be on. Sue, I know, is heavily involved. And, but,
We have some here, but they
Oh.
have a petition
Oh, okay, here. Sue.
Kay is head of the Natural Resources.
Okay, they circulate petitions. Here's one you can hear about.
Indeed, I was so glad to have the opportunity to say that the League of Women Voters is still activists for the environment. I'm the chair of the Natural Resources Committee, and we are collecting a petition for the right to clean water, a basic right in Florida. And in Orange County in 2020, we had a rights to clean water charter amendment on our ballot, and it passed by 89% and was preempted by the Florida legislature. So now we take it up one more notch, go to the state. We need 90,000 signatures by the end of the year here in Orange County. I have them. If you've already signed it and you have friends who would like to sign it, I have packages that you can take home and have them sign it and send it back in. And I really appreciate stopping and signing it.
And what does it do? What are we signing? What are we for? Now, I mean, clean water is great, you know, it's like, you know,
Good question. It will grant a basic right for people to have clean and healthy water. Just like we have the right to free speech, we have the right to.
what does that mean? I mean,
Well,
I
it'll
live in
hold
Winter
the
Park,
executive branch of government responsible for upholding the laws that protect the waters. It makes somebody responsible for keeping the waters clean.
Does that mean
And
in the
it-
ground and also in the processing and coming to your home?
Sure, Martin.
Yeah, this will be a constitution amendment to the state of Florida Constitution. And it is self-executing in that any citizen who is affected by environmental degradation has the right to sue the state for corrections to that problem. So it's an actionable thing. It's self-executing, and
What's that mean?
by self-executing means it does not require the legislature to do anything.
That's
Once we
important.
get this in the Florida Constitution, no one has to have any additional rules, laws from the state government.
It can't be preempted.
Yeah, it cannot be preempted by any action by the state. So, potentially, it will help us clean up the Indian River Lagoon, clean up the,
Owl Creek.
so
Lake
I've heard this,
Lake Apopka, there's plenty.
where we have so much degraded springs, the Florida Bay, all of these areas.
Rodman.
Yeah, the Rodman Dam, all of these things, individuals can sue the state for action to correct these problems. So that's what the petition will do if we can get it on the ballot. And that's why we ask that you sign the petition.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Kay.
I'm sorry, can I ask a question? So if I'm understanding this correctly, the legislature is that there's not a how-to that's included as to how this gets done, but it's a basic right that needs to be done, and if it is violated in some sort, then like somebody can sue. Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
First we recognize as a right.
A basic right.
Got it.
And this is a movement that's been going on in many countries. I mean, Florida, actually Orange County is leading most of the United States, but other countries have adopted the rights of nature as well. When my students ask me, what's the one thing I can do to help the environment, I tell them you register to vote. Because whether you recognize it or not, yeah, decisions about the environment are being made at the political level, and you've got to exert yourself by registering to vote and letting your representatives know that that's how you vote and that matters to you. I don't care what party you register for, get out there and be part of it. And I think that that's really important. And what you're seeing today is, political action, grassroots action, signing petitions, going to vote, talking to each other, talking in groups. And I think this is the legacy of these women for us today. Do we have time for one more question?
Yes, Dr. Poole, I have a question
go through in northern Florida?
Not a lot of details, so I'm not going to jump on that one, but I know it's been fought by a lot of activist groups.
It's been hush a lot. You don't hear about it a lot, but there is a pipeline trying to get through the state of Florida, and it's going through many environmental places up in northern Florida. So I was just wondering if you.
Yeah, the one I'm more familiar with is the tollway roads that were proposed in North Florida, and it was citizens groups that stopped that, and that was a done deal. They were already drawing up plans, and so citizen voices can still be heard. Do not get depressed. I think the definition of environmentalists is that we are optimists. We believe that change can happen, and so I encourage you all to follow the actions that these women gave us, and take up the banner from the Marjories and from everyone else, and go with that.
Yes, ladies. What are you reading now? And what are you writing now?
I have a book going to a board tomorrow. We'll see if it gets approved or not, about famous travelers in Florida, people who have come through Florida and written about it, and then I go back and retrace their steps. For example, John Muir walked through Florida in 1867, and a lot of people don't even know that, but he kept a journal the whole way through and talked about Florida, and it helped form his entire philosophy long before he ever even got to the Sierra Mountains. So that's one of the chapters, and I talk about Harriet Beecher Stowe on the Ocklawaha River, talking about how beautiful it was and writing for national newspapers about it. So I'm working on that now, and if you're looking for another book to read, a friend of mine just published a book about the history of conservation in Florida. It's called Forces of Nature, and the author is Clay Henderson, and it's he really tries to give credit where credit is due to a lot of the movers and shakers in Tallahassee who were doing some of the early land buying programs and regulations there as well. So I'm going to let you all go, and if you want to buy books, they're in the back, and I'm happy to sign them if you want.
Thank Dr.